Hello and welcome back to another edition of Press Pass on GNAT-TV. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project. It's a pleasure to have you with us today on Thursday, April 7th. It's also a great pleasure to be joined today by two outstanding reporters who are here with us to bring us up to speed in some of the areas they've been covering around the state. And Wallace Allen writes for 7 Days, a weekly newspaper and news website based in Burlington. And Emma Cotton is a writer with VTDigger, a statewide news website based in Montpelier. Emma, Ann, thank you very much for making the time for our conversation today.
Thanks so much for having me, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew.
Well, good to have you back on our program again. I guess we could start with a few areas you've been covering and writing in some of the stories that have been published in 7 Days in VTDigger. And Ann, I thought I might start with you and have you talk to us a little bit about what's going on in the housing market in Vermont. Big hot topic all over the state. Certainly it is down here. A lot of people seem to be struggling to find apartments or homes that they can afford. Well, I guess just the basic question is kind of why is it that the marketplace can't seem to respond to this clear demand for more housing?
Well, that's a great question, Andrew. And it's, something that we've started long before COVID. We've had a housing shortage in Vermont for many years. And even after the Great Recession, right afterwards, back in 2011, housing forecasters were saying that the shortage of housing stock in the country as at large is just, we haven't been building the inventory that we've been needing for many years, nationwide and in Vermont. And part of the reason for that is that the economics have changed so that it makes a little bit more sense for home builders to build larger homes. They get a larger return on their investment than they do for the sort of small homes that most people want to buy, or the starter homes that a lot of people need to buy, like a lot of workers. So in Vermont, the problem might be exacerbated by some of the environmental regs that give us the open landscapes that we like so much, and keep our efforts to keep our forests intact, things like that. A lot of the towns have their own regulations limiting where you can build housing or where you can build housing developments. I mean, many towns still have on the books that you need to build your house on a 10-acre parcel, which really sort of limits the kind of housing that would be accessible to workers. And then Act 252 has some regs in it that make it a little bit more difficult for developers to build the sort of dense housing developments, the single family homes or the multifamily buildings that have made up a lot of the housing stock in other places where there is a little bit more housing. And of course, as we know, material prices have gone completely off the charts in the last couple of years. A lot of people have left the trades. Some people left the trades after the first Great Recession, never to return. And then during the COVID pandemic, there were other people who left the trades to pursue other work because the trades had to shut down for a while there briefly. So there's a whole complex of reasons. And as you mentioned, Vermonters, and this is also a nationwide phenomenon, people don't necessarily welcome change in their own neighborhood. And so if they've been living in a place that they love the way it looks and they love their views and they love the amount of traffic they have and they don't want any more, there's a lot of ways that they can go to the town and put the kibosh on housing developments. And that has emerged as one of the biggest reasons why developers give up on trying to build multifamily housing or good-sized housing developments in towns. And, all of these things are policymakers and local people, everybody's aware of them and they're just looking for solutions. I should also add that short-term rentals, they do play a big role. We have a lot of them. And for many property owners, it makes more financial sense if you're going to buy a house to use it as a short-term rental, to rent it out to visitors than to just rent to one family that could rent it all year. So, I mean, I could go on and on. There's a lot of reasons, but it all adds up to a very big lift for the people who are trying to solve these problems.
So the legislature has a couple of bills that are addressing this. There's one on housing, I think, and also one on Act 250 working its way through the State House. But I gather the governor and the legislature have sort of a different view on how much ARPA money ought to be plugged into, helping create more housing.
Yeah, and this is money that we have an unprecedented amount of federal funding for housing right now, and in a way, it's a huge cause for celebration. I don't know if it can actually meet the equally huge demand, but as you know, our state budget is 25% larger than it has been in prior years because of all this money, and the governor has directed a lot of it toward housing. There's a lot of different proposals. One of them that is supported widely in towns and by housing policymakers is to promote the use of accessory dwelling units, or ADUs, and that is to incentivize their construction, so that if you're rattling around in a big old house somewhere, this program might give you a little bit of help in turning that into 4 apartments, and then you can stay in your house, and that creates housing without having to go through any permitting in terms of like setbacks and where you are and outside. So there's a lot of towns that are examining whether ADUs would make a difference, and the state is also looking at incentivizing those. There's quite a few provisions in Act 250 legislation that would make it easier for developers in one way or another, or make it and sort of just smooth out the process, because a lot of the time it just turns into a long and therefore expensive process to get your permitting. And I think in some cases there is pretty widespread agreement that there could be some tweaks to Act 250 that might speed the process, especially since in many cases the towns have sort of caught up with the old Act 250 regs and are themselves regulating the things that Act 250 set out to take care of 50 years ago. They've caught up. The legislature is also looking at giving money to some employers to help them create workforce housing, which is a whole nother topic, because that is, in the old days, we did have employers creating workforce housing. Those were called company towns, and in some ways they worked out great. And we have some up here in Averill, where I am on the Canadian border, and it's a lovely old boarding house that was built for loggers and is now a lodge on the lake. But in a lot of cases, it meant that workers couldn't leave their jobs because they would become unhoused if they did. So the only places where employer-created housing seems to really have worked out in Vermont so far is on farms or in ski areas. And I think part of the reason for that is that both of them are in such remote locations that there's just absolutely no other way to get your workers. And also they have quite a seasonal population of workers, so that if your worker turns out to be a great worker but not such a great tenant, they're going to be leaving soon anyway, and it just seems to sort of work out better. And for the ski areas who take students, they can house students in former motel rooms and dorm-like settings, and that seems to work for them. Anyway, I could go on and on. It's a very complex.
Well, Emma, let's turn over to you here and have you tell us a little bit about something which sounds to me on its surface to be kind of related to our housing situation. That's the question around the clean heat standard. I know you've been following that closely. I guess, what is the clean heat standard and how would it work?
Sure, yeah. So it passed the House a few weeks ago. It's now before senators. So to back up a little bit, the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed in 2020, and it requires the state to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by certain amounts in the coming decade. So our deadlines are 2025, 2030, and 2050. And the other thing the Global Warming Solutions Act did was it established a climate council that was charged with sort of coming up with a plan to figure out how we're going to reduce these emissions. And one of their biggest proposals was the clean heat standard. The thermal sector in Vermont is the second largest. It's responsible for the second largest amount of emissions after transportation. So, it's important to address emissions in this sector. It's also really tricky because you're dealing with a sector that is, in every single person's lives, pretty much. So what the clean heat standard, what it's proposed to do is create obligated parties, and those are the folks who are importing fossil fuel heat into the state, fossil fuels that are used for heating. And those obligated parties would be required to slowly transition over to clean heat solutions or acquire clean heat credits. So other entities can basically earn clean heat credits or generate clean heat credits by implementing measures that reduce emissions in the thermal sector. So installing a heat pump, for example, or switching over to fuels that burn more cleanly, or installing advanced wood systems, for example, are all things that would earn folks clean heat credits. So obligated parties will be required over time to acquire an increasing amount of those clean heat credits. And the idea is that that would slowly sort of transition the thermal sector away from fossil fuels and, over more toward things like electric heat pumps. So that's sort of the main idea behind it. There is some opposition to this bill. I think folks are really concerned that it might raise the price of home heat options for people who are currently using fossil fuels and during the transition to cleaner heat. And so that's been a really big concern. A counter argument that you often hear from proponents of the bill is that the fossil fuel market is really volatile, and we're experiencing that right now. You can see that in this present moment. So making a transition to, more steady, clean heat options could end up saving people in the long run. The question is, how do you make that transition in a way that doesn't harm the folks who are already struggling to pay their heating bills? Governor Scott has also expressed some opposition to the clean heat standard. I think he's concerned that the Public Utility Commission, which would be required to sort of implement this and figure out all the details between now and the time that it's implemented, he believes that they're taking on too much responsibility, and he would prefer elected officials and lawmakers to iron out some of those details. So I think he's sort of suggesting that the clean heat standard, after it's sort of worked out by the PUC, is then channeled back through the State House to be approved by lawmakers. But that would sort of add additional time to this. And proponents of the bill are saying that we need to pass this as soon as possible. And then the other point of opposition that you often hear from some environmentalists is that some of the clean heat measures included in the bill do have emissions that, that they're responsible for, so that they aren't as clean as maybe it's, they're being pitched, to be sort of these clean solutions, and they're not all of them are. So yeah, it's a really sort of nuanced, wonky policy. It's pretty complicated, but I think we'll see senators continuing to talk over some of the logistics in the coming months.
Well, a really fascinating subject. I guess I was also wondering, you had a piece in Digger today about the progress the state is making towards reaching those emission goals for 2025, 2030, 2050. How are we doing? Are we on track or not so much?
Yeah, I think the upshot is that it's really difficult for us to know because we don't have data. The most recent data that we have about Vermont's emission reductions are from 2018. And of course, that precedes the pandemic, where we made some pretty major changes to, for example, the way that we work. We telecommute. Many of us now telecommute, which reduces some transportation emissions. There have also been changes, I think more and more folks are installing heat pumps. Folks might be using renewable energy or installing solar. So there's a few ways that that things have changed, and it's hard for us to know where we stand at the moment. But a couple of the major proposals in that climate action plan that I referenced earlier have sort of fallen apart or won't be implemented soon enough to meet our 2025 emissions. So the clean heat standard, as it's currently written by the legislature, it was passed by the House. It would be implemented fully in 2025, the same year that we meet our first emissions deadline. In addition, the Transportation Climate Initiative Program, TCIP, was a regional initiative that multiple states were involved in. That was supposed to drastically reduce transportation emissions. And that also fell apart when a couple of governors, I think Massachusetts and Connecticut, pulled out. So there's some chance that may come back. but it's unlikely so far. And absent those two proposals, those were really the big hitters in the climate action plan. So absent those two things, we just don't have a plan that adds up to our required emissions for 2025. We could be on our way organically. We are responsible for fewer emissions reductions on our way to 2025 than, for example, 2030. But the folks I spoke to said, if we don't hit 2025, it's going to be way harder for us to meet 2030. So some potential problems down the road there.
Wow, fascinating. Well, I guess we'll see how that goes along. Certainly going to be an interesting subject for all of us to grapple with. Well, Anne, back to you. Another recent story that you had published in 7 Days involved business investment in Vermont, which apparently seems to be booming. What's going on here? Is Vermont suddenly the place for Wall Street to sink its mega billions, or is this just sort of a temporary phenomenon?
Well, as I hardly need to tell you, there's Vermont, and then there's all of Vermont. I guess, so in this case, yes, Chittenden County is on fire in a good way in terms of investment. We have seen, even beyond the outsized impact of Beta, which, as you probably know, is that aircraft company that has just attracted a phenomenal amount of money, $368 million last year. But even beyond that, other companies that are, spin-offs from the colleges, the University of Vermont's technology transfer programs, and from other tech companies in the region, are attracting colossal amounts of investment far beyond what we are used to seeing. I mean, it used to be worthy of a story if somebody got a $5 million investment in their company. I'm saying, like, in 2018 that was the case. Now we're seeing $100 million to the former dealer policy, which is now called Poly. And so this year, Fresh Tracks Capital, which is the largest venture capital fund in the state, they look at SEC filings to sort of to track how much money is coming in from investors. 2019, it was about 100 million, which was like jaw-dropping. 2020, about 100 million. 2021, 600 million. So yeah, that's going to make a big difference on Burlington for sure, on Chittenden County. And it's not all in Chittenden County. There's a share of it that's going to companies in other parts of the state, I have to say. But there's no doubt, there's no question that things are going to change with that kind of capital flowing in, especially when it comes to Beta, because they are determined to stay in Vermont. Their founder is from Vermont. He loves Vermont. They are very committed to staying in Vermont. So they are now facing phenomenal growth and looking for ways to do that in a way that works for their local planning and zoning. And we're going to see a lot of changes in Chittenden County as a result of this kind of investment. And there's a lot of reasons to believe that it's going to continue. I mean, it's diverse enough. There's the number of deals is large enough that this is not just a one-off thing. I mean, the size of that Beta investment last year might be a one-off thing for now, but I mean, in general, the investment environment is growing like crazy. And a lot of it is tech companies.
Yeah, I was going to say, it sounds like it's kind of tech-centered. Is that the case pretty much, or are we kind of across the map?
Well, it is. There's a lot of it in tech, but there's also a lot of investment happening in food and beverage companies. Like, even things like crowdfunding, which you can now also see SEC filings for, believe it or not. There's food companies, there's alcoholic beverage companies, there's regular beverage companies. They too are seeing an inflow of capital. So there is that tech boom. And there was also a report that came out from the Vermont Technology Alliance Monday that said that Vermont's technology job growth is very, very high right now. And actually our investment growth was the highest in the nation, according to PitchBook. Not year over year. I mean, proportionally highest, compared to what it has been. Not year over year, but over the first two, including the 2 years before the pandemic, and then the 2 years since the pandemic started. So a little bit of a bigger spread. But Vermont is definitely benefiting from a trend of companies looking beyond Silicon Valley and other traditional tech hotbeds to smaller places. Vermont was at the top, but it was closely followed by Montana and Iowa and Idaho, which are also not necessarily places you think of the masters of the universe gathering to get their investments. that's what's happening. It's being dispersed, and Burlington is benefiting from that.
Emma, back to you. You recently wrote a story that I found quite interesting involving a farm in Addison County in Panton, I think, where two neighbors were at loggerheads over agricultural effluent that was flowing from one property and into Lake Champlain. I guess that has that court case now been resolved? And I guess I was also wondering, what do you see as the long range implications for agriculture in the state around that? If let's say a neighbor could have concerns about fertilizer runoff or whatever, and say, "Hey, you can't do that." Is that going to be an issue for farmers in the state?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. This case has been really interesting. I think it's been at the center of a lot of different conversations since it began. So what happened was, there's a family who lives in Panton part-time, the Hoppers. They're from Texas. They have agricultural backgrounds. They moved to the state a little while ago. The Vorstevelds are their neighbors. They own a large dairy operation, on the adjacent land. The Vorstevelds have made some changes to their farming practices over the last few years. They have installed tile drains mainly. I think that's sort of the biggest change. And tile drains are sort of these perforated pipes that you can put into the ground. They're designed to help keep fields dry. And, the soil in Addison County is famously super clay rich and it's wet. So tile drains can help crops grow. The other thing that can sometimes happen is that water is channeled through the drains into sort of one outlet. And in this case, that outlet has sort of spilled water down onto the Hopper property, through their property and into Lake Champlain. And the Hoppers have claimed that they are seeing much more water than they did before. It's the sort of brown color. It's hard to tell whether that brownness is coming from manure or soil particles. That was sort of a debate during the trial. So this trial took place over 3 days in December and 3 days in January. It was pretty intense. The judge just issued an order. The order basically says that the Vorstevelds are going to need to stop this runoff. They're going to need to find a solution and also address a strong smell that's coming from the farm. There are a few pieces that are left in this case. It's not to get too much into the weeds, but it's pretty much resolved, and the judge has ordered that needs to happen. So, there are a number of conversations that have sort of spilled out from this trial. One is a conversation about the right to farm, as you mentioned. There is a bill that is probably will not pass this session, but is a big conversation among some lawmakers. And it basically strengthens this law that already exists that says that farmers, as long as they're operating within the bounds of state regulation, have the right to farm without the threat of nuisance lawsuits. Vermont's right to farm law is not as strong as in other states. So the amendment that is being proposed in this bill would strengthen that law. So it would make it harder for a property owner to bring a suit against a farm because that farm, doesn't smell good or something. And the idea here is that as more and more people move from out of state to Vermont, they may not be familiar with Vermont's farming community, and that farmers who have, often very little resources to begin with should not have to go through the burden of hiring a lawyer and going through some of these really expensive, time-consuming suits when they are not, out of compliance with state regulations. Then on the other hand, you have environmentalists who are saying, if the Vorstevelds are operating within state regulations, look at this effluent that is flowing into Lake Champlain. The Hoppers property is on Arnold Bay, right on the lake. And there's been a big effort, of course, to reduce the amount of phosphorus in Lake Champlain. We're seeing these algae blooms. Much of that is coming from farms in the state. So, if this is something that, is allowed within the state regulations, then maybe we need to take a look at the state regulations and adjust. So that's been sort of a conversation among environmentalists that's come out of this case. So it's really interesting is these two families who are sort of having this conversation among themselves, and meanwhile there's all of these sort of tangential conversations going on that come back to that case.
Since this sort of follows up kind of a little bit, I think, on what you were just describing there in the Panton case, and that was that issue around spraying Lake Bumazine. I know there were several folks down here who were kind of a little bit concerned about plans to spray Lake Bumazine to, I guess, retard algae growth in the state. There was a demonstration up in Castleton against it. Can you just tell us real quick what our status is on that one?
Sure. So, the Lake Bumazine Association has filed a permit application with the state. They're looking to spray this sort of new herbicide called Procelacor to limit milfoil, which is Eurasian water milfoil is invasive. It is the most common or the most abundant plant in Lake Bumazine, according to one of the surveys. It can impact the ecosystem. It can impact recreation. And so, they're looking for ways to try to control it. There has certainly been a very, very big reaction to that permit application. Folks are concerned both that this chemical that they're thinking about spraying could impact human health. Lake Bumazine is a drinking water source for some folks. And then also that if the milfoil does disappear really rapidly, that could impact fish that have sort of adapted to be able to live with milfoil as part of their habitat. So you have anglers who are opposing this very strongly, and you also have folks who are just generally concerned about the environmental impacts. That there will be more public comment if there, once a draft permit comes out on this, so folks will have additional opportunities to say their piece, and that should come out this summer.
All right. Well, Anne, back to you. To close us out here, I guess I found myself wondering, with all the upheaval in energy markets, inflation rising at levels we haven't seen since the 1970s, and I'm old enough to remember those days, and that wasn't a whole lot of fun. What is your sense of the economic outlook or sentiment among the state's business leaders? Do you feel like, you just were telling us there a moment ago about the investment money that's flowing into the state, and that sounds like things are going pretty well. But are the state's business folks going, this could be a tricky year, or are they feeling fairly confident that finally, with COVID hopefully over, it's kind of sort of back to quote unquote normal?
I think it's clear that we have a lot of people here who want to do things, and there's a lot of visitors who are coming back to Vermont. And there's a ton of economic activity going on. Obviously businesses are trying to hire or trying to build buildings to accommodate their increased business. But I was just telling somebody today that whenever I start talking to somebody who owns a business about any topic, the conversation invariably actually returns to childcare. It's holding them back because their workers are not able to work as reliably as or as much as they need to. So business leaders are definitely tackling these public policy issues in a way that I haven't seen before. They're trying to puzzle out some things that are making it difficult for them to get the workers they need. So in other words, I can't give you a clear answer, really.
Well, yeah, childcare. Boy, that's another one along with housing that's on top of mind for many folks. I want to thank you both again for making the time for our conversation today. And Wallace Allen writes for 7 Days. Emma Cotton writes for VTDigger. I want to thank both of you for being with us. And well, we'll see you again, hopefully soon, back here on Press Pass. And also thank all of you who've been watching us today. I hope you found our program interesting, and well, we'll see you again the next time. Meanwhile, have a great day.